Good afternoon. Myself Akanksha Shukla, and I am going to teach one of the most important topic of data analytics, that is support vector methods and what are the kernel methods inside it. So basically, what are the kernel methods? If we see that what are the kernels or what are the kernel functions, then the kernels or kernel methods are a set of different types of algorithms which are being used for the pattern analysis. Means for doing pattern analysis, whatever the algorithms which we use, then these sets or these constituents are considered as the kernels or the kernel methods. The kernel methods are used to solve a non-linear problems by using a linear classifiers. Now the kernel methods are employed, or these are used in the support vector machines, and support vector machines are used in classification and regression problems. So the question arises that what are the classification problems and what are the regression problems. So the classification is a kind of problem in which whatever the observations we are having, then we have to categorize that observations into the classes. Okay. And what are the regression problems? Inside this, the regression problems are those problems in which we predict the output for a given example. Just like if we take an example, and for that prediction we use the regression analysis. And in regression analysis, what we do, we have to identify the relationship between the dependent variables and independent variables. So suppose if we take an example that tobacco leads to heart disease. So here tobacco is a dependent variable and heart disease is an independent variable. So the relationship between these factors and these variables can be easily analyzed by using the regression analysis, and these kinds of problems comes under the regression problems. Now the SVM, the support vector machines, uses what is called the kernel trick, where the data is transformed and an optimal boundary is found for the possible outputs. Means in SVM what we do, we use a kernel tricks where the data is transformed and we have to find, or using that kernel trick we find the optimal solution or we find the optimal boundary for the possible outputs. Now these four terms are basic terms which we have to understand before moving towards the support vector machines. First one is hyperplane. Hyperplane is a separation line which is used to separate the two data classes in the higher dimensions rather than the actual dimension. Second term is kernel, which is a function, and it is used to map the data points when they are plotted in the higher dimensions. And this function is termed as the kernel, and we have different types of kernels, just like sigmoidal kernel, polynomial kernel, and Gaussian kernel, and many more kernels, just like RBF, radian basis functions. So these types of kernels we use to find out the kernel functions. Second, next term is boundary lines. These are the two lines which are drawn around the hyperplane. Means boundary lines are drawn. For example, if this is a graph and suppose this is a hyperplane we have drawn, then this is a boundary line. Means these are the two lines which are drawn around the hyperplane at a distance of epsilon. Okay. It is used to create a margin between the data points. Next one is support vector. This is the vector which is used to define that hyperplane, or we can say that these are the extreme data points in a particular data sets which helps in defining the hyperplane, and these data points lie closest to the boundary. Means the data points which lie closest to this boundary comes under the, or they are termed as the support vector. Now why we use why there is need for the kernel methods? So before we get into the working of the kernel methods, it is more important to understand the support vector machines, because these kernels are implemented in the SVM models. Okay, so the support vector machines are supervised machine learning algorithms. In supervised machine learning algorithms, the data are trained and labeled. Okay, So the support vector machines are supervised machine learning algorithms, and these are used in the classifications and regression problems which I had discussed in the starting of the lecture. Now here this is a graph in which a separation line is drawn. We can see here, and the data points are separated. The blue dots and green dots are separated here. So here we can see easily that hyperplane which is separating the green dots and the blue dots, and this is a hyperplane. Okay, but a hyperplane is a one dimension less than the ambient plane. So in the above figure we can see that we have two dimensions which are representing the ambient space, but the lone which divides or classifies the space is the one dimension less than the ambient space, and that's why it is called the hyperplane here. Now it is very difficult. We can see or we can identify that it is difficult to solve the classification using a linear classifier, as there is no good linear line that should be used or that should be able to classify the red and green dots, as the points are randomly distributed here. So what we do, we use the kernel function here which takes the points to the higher dimensions. Means why we use kernel methods? We use kernel methods because if in actual dimension or if in low dimension we can't separate or we can't be able to classify the data easily, then what we do, we use kernel function and which takes the points to the higher dimensions and then solves the problem over there, and then it returns the output here. So here we can see that the green dots are enclosed in some perimeter area while the red one lies outside it here in the low dimension. Likewise, there could be other scenarios where green dots might be distributed in a trapezoidal shaped area. So what we do here, we have to convert that two-dimensional plane which was first classified by one-dimensional hyperplane to the three-dimension area. And here our classifier, that is hyperplane, will not be a straight line but a 2D plane which will cut the area, as we can see here in this diagram. Okay, here we can see that the 2D cut hyperplane, this can easily separate the green dots with the red dots here. So what we see here, that when in the low dimensions the data points are not be getting easier to separate, then what we do, with the use of kernel function, we take this data to the higher dimensions, and with the use of 2D plane we can separate or we can cut the areas which is easily identifying or which is easily separating the data points both of green or red colors. Now in order to get a mathematical understanding of a kernel, we see here the Lilly-Jiang's equations of kernel, which says that kx comma y is equal to fx comma fy, where k is the kernel function, x and y are the dimensional inputs, f is the map function from n dimensional to m dimensional space, and x comma y is the dot product. So whenever we have to find the kernel function, what we find? We find the dot product of x and y, and if it is equal to the k x dot y, then we can say that the kernel function is fulfilling this equation. Now there are different types of kernels and methods in SVM. First one is linear kernel, in which we have two vectors x1, and the linear kernel is defined by the dot product of these two vectors x1 comma s2. Next one is polynomial kernel. In polynomial kernel we have an equation in which we find the dot product x1 dot x2 plus 1, which multiplies with d. Here d is the degree of the polynomial and x1 and x2 are the vectors. Now in the Gaussian kernel, this kernel is an example of a radial basis function kernel, and here this is an equation for finding the Gaussian kernel. Here the sigma plays a very important or primary role in the performance of a Gaussian kernel, and it should neither be overestimated and nor be underestimated. So it should be carefully tuned as per the problem which we are considering. Now come to the main topic, that is support vector machines. This is a machine which is used in a machine learning, and it is defined as a data science algorithm which is belonging to the class of supervised learning. Means this machine analyzes the trends and characteristics of the data sets which we are having and solves the problem related to the classification and regression. It is based on the learning framework of VC theory. The full form of VC theory is Vapnik-Chervonik's theory, and in this each of the training data points is marked as one of the two categories. Okay, then these data points iteratively build a region which can be able to separate the data points in the space into the two groups. Just like data points in the region can be well separated across the boundary with the minimum gap. Now, to set these different data points into the respective one of the two categories, it comes under the non-probabilistic binary classifier. So, whenever a new example comes into the space, then the corresponding group is predicted from the features and then it can be assigned to the same group of the data points which we are considering here. Now, the support vector machine can also be able to generalize the characteristics which can be able to differentiate the training data which is provided to the algorithm, and it can be obtained by checking the boundary which differentiates the two classes by the maximum margin or by the maximum gap. Now, the boundary which separates the two classes is known as a hyperplane, which I had discussed earlier, and even if the name has a plane, then if there are two features, then this hyperplane can be a line in a 3D and it will be a plane and so on. Means based on the features or the dimensions, that hyperplane can be in the different form. Okay. Next here in the given example what we see that we are assuming the data is a 2D, two-dimensional data we are assuming, and we are gradually move on to the 3D as well as in the subsequent given data. Okay. So, in the given graph what we see there are two kinds of data. First one is stars having 5 points and the second having 4 corners. Means there are two kinds of data. First kind of data set is having the stars having 5 points and the second one is 4 points here. Now, the sample space will give to the, or we are going to assign the hyperplanes for that sample space. So, what we do? We draw a 4 hyperplane A, B, C and D. Now, in the given example what we see that the hyperplane A lies over the corner of the two data points. This is means star having 4 dots and star having 5 dots. So, whenever there is any mishappening to this hyperplane, then this can distract the data points. Similarly, if we see the hyperplane B, then it also lies close to the some data points, and for the D hyperplane line, it also taken considerance into the data points which lie closest to that hyperplane. So, apart from A, B, C, D, what we see that A, B and D hyperplane lies, but some of the data points lies closest to these 3 hyperplanes. So, we consider C hyperplane as the best hyperplane for separation of these two kinds of data points. Okay. So, here in the previous example what we see that the data points which lie closest to the separable lines are known as the support vectors, and the distance of the support vectors from that separable line determines the best hyperplane. So, here we can see that the distance of data points from the hyperplane C is the maximum. That's why C is considered as the best hyperplane. Okay. Now, for the most optimum separation, we follow some basic rules. First one is maximum separation and the second one is best separation. Means for maximum separation what we do? We select the line which is able to segregate all the data points into the corresponding classes, and that's why we narrowed it down to A, B, C, D. Means we have drawn 4 hyperplanes. Okay, but out of these 4 hyperplanes, which hyperplane we have considered? The hyperplane which is used or which is segregating or which is doing the maximum margin or which is used to have the maximum width from the corresponding support vectors. So, out of the lines A, B, C, D, we choose the one which has the maximum margin to classify the data points. So, we select the C. Now, for non-linearly separable data, what we see, we need to decide the boundary for that kind of data also. So, here we can see that a single straight line or single hyperplane cannot be used to differentiate the data points or to differentiate the stars of blue color and red color. So, what we do here, we draw a circle that can differentiate the blue stars and red stars. So, every time a straight line cannot be used to differentiate the data points. So, this is known as the kernel trick, in which the data is projected into the higher dimensions and then we construct a plane so that the data points can be segregated easily. Now, what are the some advantages and disadvantages of support vectors? First one is, since only the support vectors are important to determine the hyperplane, so this algorithm has the highest stability. Second one is, inside this support vectors, outliers. Outliers are those data points. In clustering, we are going to analyze the outliers. So, what are the clusters? Clusters consist of data points which are exhibiting the similar properties. Suppose there is a class having students of IT department or information technology department, and here comes a student from EC department. So, that student, suppose this is a classroom consists of students of IT, and suppose a student of EC comes, then that student of EC will be considered as an outlier which does not lie in the same cluster, that will be considered as the outside of these clusters. So, outliers are those data points which are not having the characteristics that can be belong to the same cluster. So, inside this, that kind of data points or that data points cannot have impact or doesn't influence the decision of the hyperplane. Now, here data set need not to have predefined assumptions, and since only support vectors are involved, so this algorithm is memory efficient as well also. What are the disadvantages? Disadvantages are, first one is the training time is higher whenever the data set is large or huge amount of data set. Whenever we are considering the huge amount of data set, then the training time will be high. Second one is, in case the target class is overlapping even at higher dimension also, then SVM or support vector machine will start performing poorly. Means, whenever the target class is overlapping, even whenever we are not able to segregate the data at a single dimension, at a low dimension, then what the kernel method do? It will take the data points to the higher dimensions. But even if at that higher dimension also the target class is overlapping, so at that time SVM starts to perform poorly. And the last disadvantage is that SVM doesn't provide the probability estimate, so it makes it even tougher to interpret during the training on what to do the next, because there is no any probability estimation for future prediction. Now, what are the support vector regression? Basically, it is a regression algorithm or regression algorithm. In regression analysis, what we do, we have to find the relationship between the dependent or independent variables. So, it is a kind of regression algorithm which supports both linear and non-linear regression, and this method works on the principle of support vector machine. Just like support vector machine, it also works, but the main basic difference is that SVR differs from SVM in that point that SVM is a classifier which we use to predict the categorical labels, while SVR is a regression which is used for predicting continuous ordered variables. Okay, here we can see that in this graph, this is a hyperplane which is used to separate the data points here, and this dotted line indicates the boundary line which is around the hyperplane at a distance of plus epsilon and negative epsilon from the hyperplane only. Now, the working of SVR, it works on the principle of SVM with having few differences. Here we have data points and we have to find the curve. So it is a regression algorithm. So instead of using the curve as a decision boundary, it uses the curve to find the match between the vector and position of the curve. So it helps in determining the closest match between the data points and the function which we use to represent them. This is the following steps which are used to in the working of SVR. First is collection of training set, then selection of kernel along with the parameters, then we have to create the correlation matrix, and then we have to train the machine to get the contraction coefficient, which is alpha is equal to alpha I. Now we create an estimator using these coefficients. So that's all about kernel methods, support vector methods and support vector machine. Thank you.